first is a little bit about Sahan Literary Forum. We are a small collective of women group, readers, and we often partner with African Studies program to bring authors. So I will read what my co-Sahan colleagues want me to say about Sahan. So Sahan Literary Forum is a platform to promote books about the Horn of Africa and create spaces for inclusive, engaging, and uplifting conversations. So as the Somali word Sahan means, we are always in search of books that nourish the imagination, and at this time our focus is in the Horn of Africa. And the reason that we choose that region is we usually feel we don't hear much about the region, and more importantly, we don't hear much about the region, about the people who are from there. So the authors we seek are usually people who are from there, or who are actually writing from a non-biased perspective. What we hear about the Horn is not very pleasant. So the books we choose are also happy books, books that talk about the cultural and the history, and not the strife and the challenges. So that's Sahan, and it's a 3 membership group, very small. So I will introduce our distinguished visitors today. And the glass is coming off and on because it's so Safia Aidid is a PhD candidate in history at Harvard University. Her research interests include empire, decolonization and state making, national and cultural imaginaries, political geography, and historical ethnography. She's now working on a dissertation titled Ethiopia, Greater Somalia, and the Somali National Imagination, which examines Somali nationalism and its interaction with the Ethiopian state between 1943 and 1988. Sitting with her is Hawa Mire. I say Hawa, it's written Hawa in English, but in the Somali it's Ha, so it's Hawa here, but it's Hawa when I say it. Hawa Mire is a diasporic Somali storyteller, writer, and strategist who focuses on themes of blackness and indigeneity. Okay? That's an English problem. Disconnection and unbelonging. Her writing is seated somewhere between oral tradition and the written word, celestial and myth, past and present, ancestry and spirit. An MES candidate in the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University, her research incorporates traditional Somali stories with discourses of constructed identity while pulling from the archival histories of resistant and radical curatorial practices. So Hawa is, when I heard she was a storyteller, I knew that we would have something in common. So, welcome to Ottawa. Thank you for coming, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you for having us, for inviting us. I spent 9 years of my life in Ottawa as a child, so it's great to be back. So I'm going to start us off. I had planned for a very different talk for today. To speak about Adan Studies and the analytical challenge. First of all, does everyone hear me? I have a sometimes a soft voice. I'm not sure if it's loud enough. Everyone in the back's okay? Okay, great. So I planned for a different talk to speak about Adan Studies and the analytical challenge it poses for Somali studies, but decided actually on the train here this morning that due to events in the last few days, the most recent installation in rather disturbing reactions to Adan Studies over the last few months, that there's a sense of urgency to speak to some of those reactions. Not as a response, I say this because many of them are not worth elevating with a response, but to reflect on their logics and to analyze how these reactions offer a window and an insight into the mechanisms, the banal mechanisms of power. So what I offer today are some of those reflections, an analysis that's very much still in formation, and that I plan to flesh out in a longer, more developed and public piece, which I think is critical, perhaps later this month, which would be a documentation and an analysis of our experience in this. So I'll begin by talking a little bit about the Adan Studies intervention, its origination, the analytical work that it does, and a brief history of the debate as it's developed and played out over the last 6 months. The hashtag Adan Studies, Adan meaning white in Somali, began in late March with my call for a social media-based conversation using the hashtag following the launch of an academic journal called the Somaliland Journal of African Studies. It described itself on its website as a journal, and I quote, covering African affairs at large, but with a particular focus on East Africa and the Horn, and put together, again, quote, put together with students and scholars at the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Hargeisa. Not one Somali academic or student was present on the journal's editorial board of advisors and authors, not from Hargeisa, not from elsewhere. The editorial and advisory boards were made up of 9 European and US-based academics, as well as 2 graduate student editors and 3 Ethiopian academics affiliated with Adesanmi University. On March 24th, I made a Facebook post which was circulated widely and sent to public to encourage discussion. And I'll quote directly from my post at that time. Inspired by the exclusion and erasure of Somalis from the new Somaliland Journal of African Studies, we're going to have a Twitter conversation tomorrow using the hashtag Adan Studies and tweet to the journal's editor-in-chief. Adan is a Somali term for white or whiteness, and the hashtag captures important questions of power, authority, and knowledge production about the Somali territories and how Somalis continue to be marginalized in academic and policy studies concerning them and the Horn of Africa more broadly. Shortly after, one of the journal's advisory board members, a German anthropologist named Marcus Huna, commented on the Facebook post and left multiple comments until he was asked to leave the thread. Among his comments were that Somalis are not marginalized in academia because there are no Somalis to speak of in academia, that he has not seen many Somalis who would qualify as serious scholars, and explained that this is due to Somalis not valuing scholarship, that Somali students lack the work ethic to produce academic work, and that those of us who are making this critique are doing so because we are, and I quote, not looking beyond our Somali navels. The Twitter-based activism stretched out over a few days, with Somalis around the world critiquing the ways Somalis are represented in academic work, media, and popular culture, sharing their own experiences of marginalization and how these representations have impacted their lives, and asking critical questions of Somali studies and what it means as a field of studies that relegates them to the role of subjects, of objects of studies, and not its legitimate producers. An open letter to Marcus Huna and the Somaliland Journal of African Studies that I authored, emphasizing the Adan Studies' critique of power and knowledge production in Somali studies, and describing Huna's comments and the journal's exclusions as evidence of the validity of the critique and as signifiers of the state, the field's current state, was signed by hundreds of Somali academics, students, professionals, activists, and concerned community members, as well as academic allies, non-Somali academic allies around the world. So what analytical work is Adan Studies doing? Perhaps the most important, seen in the very naming of the hashtag as a tongue-in-cheek inversion of Somali studies, and in its hybridity of both Somali and English, is that we, Somali people, are gazing back, speaking back, studying them, explaining them. It names the mechanisms of power sustaining non-Somali dominance over knowledge about Somalis. It destabilizes and displaces these exclusive claims on universality. It historicizes Somali studies as a knowledge field inextricably linked to the historical process of the colonization of the Somali. It highlights how colonial formulations and logics reincarnate themselves and continue in the present, structuring how knowledge is produced about the Somali territories and diaspora. It asks questions about what these histories and continuing processes mean for Somali representation and agency, both at the level of discourse and the capacity to access power. It theorizes a vantage point of alterity from which to engage and critique the academy, both from within, by those of us who are already here, but also by non-academics who have asked who counts as a producer of knowledge. We've emphasized over and over in multiple platforms, conferences, articles, blog posts, that this is a structural historical argument and not one that can be reduced to identity politics, nativism, and essentialism. Yet this is how Adan Studies is often deliberately misread by non-Somali academics, researchers, and practitioners in Somali studies. It's a form of intellectual dishonesty and a mechanism for disciplining young Somali scholars who challenged power. So what's being performed here is revelatory. For it shows how we've challenged systematic exclusions, structural positionings, and relations of power, and shows how these things are being reenacted in the very responses to Adan Studies. So I'm going to just talk about a few kind of recent incidents, events, episodes, just as an example or a reading of these for what I've described. Some of you may be aware that the Somali Studies International Association had its annual meeting this August. So at the time of Adan Studies, this was in March, so this was ahead, and this was a huge debate in Somali Studies, and many people called for the Somali Studies International Organization to address this or incorporate it into the conference in some way. At the time, there was complete silence from the organizers. It was only about a month before the conference, a few weeks before the conference, that they addressed it for the first time in a document called the Whose Voice document. So Whose Voice was essentially explaining Adan Studies, reducing it again to the questions of identity politics, who's able to talk, who's authentic, who's not, which is something we very much tried to get away from. But, and then we were compelled to respond. Another thing that was founded in the aftermath of Adan Studies was a website called Mire. So it's a collective of young Somali scholars who run the blog and podcast. And as Mire, we decided to issue a response then to talk a little bit about this and explain why Whose Voices as a document was appropriative, renaming Adan Studies as Whose Voice, and also in the document decided that they wouldn't actually make space for it in their program. Decided that it was a call for reflection essentially, telling people, yes, let's think about reflexivity during the conference, however we don't have space for any new roundtables or new panels. So from the outset, organizers were asked, again I mentioned, to address Adan Studies by some of the founders of the Somali Studies International Association, pretty much ignored it. And then finally with this document, we're compelled to respond to me and to Mendep, after which they offered me, and the audio is actually available online, you could listen to that on our SoundCloud, but felt compelled to respond to me and offer some space on the date of the conference. So I was in Helsinki at that point, attending the launch of the conference, and then they said, Safia, we'd like to ask you to speak. And then what they had offered was 7 minutes for me, and then 2 other people, one of whom would be one of the organizers. And then I had asked that, I'll participate only if the third member of the panel is a young Somali scholar, the people who have engaged with this from the beginning. That was refused, and then only later, after I refused to participate, did they give us full space. And so it was me and Ahmed Ibrahim, another PhD student, who had then addressed the Congress. So something that was really interesting then, if some of you have listened to the audio, you can hear one of the organizers ask directly why. Why did it take so long for the Somali Studies International Association to address this and to incorporate? So I transcribed some of her words, which are very interesting. So her response was that when the debate flared up, it became very aggressive. Another quote is, although the tone, maybe it was not intended, but the tone that appeared was very aggressive, and we didn't want to have that kind of fight here. What we were expecting, and they're speaking to me here, what we were expecting was some kind of contact, direct contact. We heard from the side that we should take it up, but take up what? Take up the quarrel? No. What we finally did end up with is this, and I appreciate it because we're moving forward. But it could have been initiated in our direction differently by making contact directly with organizers. Again, they're speaking to me. The way you were doing it, that it was sort of breaking the window when the door was not locked. And I think it could have made for a more easy inclusion in the program. I didn't want to say this, but the question was asked on why it became included so late. So I think that's very revelatory in the way that the tropes kind of play out there. I was painted as aggressive, or we were aggressive, although, I'm not an aggressive person at all. I think I'm relatively soft-spoken, and I've articulated my points very carefully and using that language. However, it's that framing, the anger, the rebellious native, the Somalis who were speaking from emotions. I think that was shown in that. And also I think for the Somali Studies International Association, also kind of that contestation over the terms of debate. It was, we'll include you in this way, after again we pushed for it, and after refusals. We'll offer you in this way. It'll exist in this way. So it's that disciplining that was constantly taking place, that, the little spaces were created, but again, management over how the conversation was taking place is something that was continually described. Following the roundtable, there was actually a Helsinki-based journalist who had recorded it, and the audio is from her. She had asked our permission to record, and by us I mean the speakers, the only people who are identified in the audio, and we said, of course, that's fine, just like it's being recorded right now. The audio was then posted on Mendap's SoundCloud, circulated quite widely, and then it was on the Somali Studies, it was a Somali Studies listserv, the Somali Research Network, that some complaints were issued, and this was actually by Marcus Huna, who had initiated that thread. So he had said that, there's some ethical issues with audio being posted. What he said was that the audience should have been asked their permission, although it was, of course, a public event, a public venue. And then kind of made an issue of Adan Studies, because it's so concerned with ethics, you should have known better, really. And so kind of was his idea of a gotcha moment, look at these folks trying to catch us in that. After that, one of the organizers responded to actually amplify his response and say that's true, no one in the institution was actually asked, none of us gave permission, and I agree that it would have been an ethically valuable to have asked permission. And again, they're not actually asking us here to remove the audio, which is, you can do that. You could say there's ethical issues and then ask us to remove the audio, but simply saying it to kind of prove a point of how we lack ethics is what was being said. So again, another instance of the disciplining that was taking place, and these are people who are more senior to me, senior scholars who have nothing at stake, but rather kind of putting a graduate student on the spot in that. So again, another example. Finally, and this is what I mentioned that in the last few days took place, one of the editors of the Somaliland Journal of African Studies wrote his own piece. So this was the PhD student that I mentioned. So he wrote a piece, and this is again 6 months later, wrote a piece that was called, I have the title here, A Quarrel, The Future Somalia, or How to Turn Somali Studies into Studies. So here it misrepresents Adan Studies as an essentialist argument, or saying that Somalis are calling for sole Somali ownership and domination of Somali studies. It erased the structural conditioning and positionings kind of in the systems. What we've painstakingly tried to show in our writings and in our speaking, but reduced the critique then to kind of these reactionary, simple-minded Somalis who are resorting to identity politics. In fact, at one point in a subsequent discussion about the article, the author refers to me in a discussion as white in relation to Somalis in the Somali territories because of my location in the West and my education. So again, kind of a misunderstanding of structural positioning, of really what racism fundamentally is and what white privilege is, what whiteness is in the theoretical sense. The piece also appropriates the arguments that I and others have been making. So in order to kind of construct the straw man argument, then he then articulates many of the things that we've written about, which is the need to decolonize Somali studies and the ways of doing it. So then he positions himself as the theorist, the one who's doing it responsibly, the one who's devoid of emotions, who's objective enough and distant enough from Somalis and Somali studies to be able to assert that critique. So he speaks of his right to speak about Somalis, specifically referring to Somaliland, and uses the piece to essentially explain to us how to responsibly think and how to use theory and ideas. So those are kind of a few incidents that have been taking place. It's, I think, very interesting and almost surreal to kind of be at the center of some of these things, but I think it's important to use it as a way of theorizing, ways in which many of the things that we're describing are then reenacted and replayed in the very response. Really what you're seeing is a reaction to kind of power being made visible and the need to conceal it then. Kind of a reaction to the loss of the monopoly over Somali studies, and really derailing tactics, I think, that are taking place at this point. So those are just some ideas that I'm kind of throwing out there as I'm trying to work through some of these, and I look forward to the workshop tomorrow to talk to others in other fields, to think also about kind of positioning and location and kind of the violence that's sometimes unleashed on people for asserting a critique of violence. Sometimes that happens as well. But I will be thinking through some of these things and writing more in the next few weeks because it does feel urgent at this point. So with that, I will leave it to Hawa.
Kind of before I start, I just want to acknowledge that we're on Algonquin traditional territory. And one of the reasons that acknowledgement is important for me is the same systems that have removed me from a place that I consider home are also allowing me to be a settler on this land. So I think the ideas of power that we're critiquing are also directly implicated in the places that we're living and working and breathing in now. So I think I want to start with that. I think that's very important. And I really want to echo Safia's earlier words that the purpose of the intervention of Adan Studies wasn't about calling for removal of non-Somalis from Somali studies, but in fact examining power imbalances and dynamics, systemic barriers, white supremacy, and ongoing colonialism. Somali studies as a field or area of study is no more or less different from other areas of study and just a subject to critique, though kind of entrenched scholars in Somali studies would beg to differ on that point. And understanding this kind of gives us a broader look at the valuable and concrete links between white supremacy within the academic industrial complex and ongoing imperialist and colonial projects. So to start, I want to refer to Fred Moten's recent response to the Black Lives Matter movement, because I think it's helpful for us in thinking through this. And what I want to say as I read this quote is to listen to the language that he's using, because I'm going to try and pick some of it apart to kind of look at what Adan Studies could be, how we could potentially frame Adan Studies. So he says, we need to understand what it actually is the state is defending itself from. And I think that in this respect, the particular instances of Michael Brown's murder and Eric Gardner's murder are worth paying some attention to, because what the drone, listen to his wording here, the drone, Darren Wilson, shot into that day was insurgent black life walking down the street. I don't think he meant to violate the individual personhood of Michael Brown. He was shooting at mobile black sociality, walking down the street in a way that he understood implicitly constituted a threat to the order that he represents and that he is sworn to protect. Eric Gardner, on the everyday basis, initiated a new alternative kind of marketplace, another mode of social life. That's what they killed. So when we say that Black Lives Matter, I think what we do sometimes is obscure the fact that it's in fact black life that matters, but that insurgent black social life still constitutes a profound threat to the already existing order of things. So in saying this, the production of a particular kind of knowledge within an academic framework is a colonial practice, right? We tend to forget that in our everyday theorizing. In saying that we're centering ourselves as Somalis, what we do is inadvertently reject a colonial knowledge production, just in the very act of saying, no, our voices are important in this particular dialogue. And that heightens the urgency of these units, or drones, as Moten calls them. And the response is because Somalis, Africans, black folks are responding to the extreme injustices happening within an academic industrial project and an ongoing colonial state. That in and of itself is an act of insurgency. So for the state, I really want to say this because I think it's important to understand in the ways that we're being framed here, it's an act of insurgency. It's an act of open defiance against the system of white supremacy. So the tenured academics and researchers who have professionally and financially benefited for years off the construction and production of Somali knowledge, who respond to Adan Studies with claims of exclusivity and reverse racism are in effect responding to what they perceive to be the blatant disregard for white supremacy, for the blatant disregard of a colonial administration and an ongoing colonial project that still remains within academic modes of production. So if we think of those who are responding as units or drones operating within a broader system, none of the attacks become different. They're precisely the same. They attempt to reduce calls for looks at systemic power and injustices to the individual. And they reduce what becomes a broader call for a righting of wrongs, so to speak, to the individual and to the deeply personal. It becomes about Safia. It becomes about me. The act of any of us challenging an expertise that is believed to have more value, not only than our physical bodies, but our experiential knowledges of our understandings of our own identities as realities, then becomes reduced to bickering. When an analysis of white supremacy and power imbalances are reduced to bickering and infighting, and a desire for everyone to be more self-reflexive, and I'm using quotes very intentionally here, right, because these are the words thrown back at us in our various capacities, we can see very quickly that we've struck a nerve. To legitimize these analyses, or even ignore them, is impossible for these scholars. Because in doing so, they would then have to acknowledge and name what we all already know about the world that we live in. The power remains in leaving it unnamed. Is everyone following me as I go? Okay. So, I want to, there's a particular reason that I want to structure it like this, because then we don't get caught up in this idea that Somali studies is somehow different from other people doing decolonial work. And it's the precise, I would say, mechanism that folks in Somali studies are using to disrupt our ability to use these terms and do this work. They're trying to make it very essentialist and very much about the Somali, when in fact it actually has very little to do with Somali people as a whole. It has everything to do with power. So in examining this, I think it's important to note that Somali modes of knowledge production, as part of our embodied experiential understanding of what it means to be Somali, are not valued within the academy, and particularly in a field of study that directly implicates our lives, right? So when I'm talking about an embodied experiential, and I really, we get lost in these academic words, and I really want to break it down because I think it's something that is very visceral and we can feel. I'm talking about there's a way in which experiences land on a Somali body that implicates it differently, right? Experiences around Somaliness in particular, right? And I'm going to get more into that as we go through. And that there's a great, if not added, benefit for non-Somali scholars to date who have taken it upon themselves to produce knowledges that we suddenly become subjected to. Talk up, sorry. Knowledge production is not a neutral task, and to ignore the ways in which the knowledge produced reifies racist, sexist, and otherwise oppressive environments pretends that the academy isn't actively engaged in the production itself. We must center Somaliness and Somali stories in how this knowledge becomes produced moving forward. So when I talk about stories, and I talk quite often about stories, and stories and orality are a very functional part of the way in which the Somali community many times conducts itself. And you can see there's a glaring gap between what's being produced academically and what the response then becomes for Somalis and about Somalis, right? Adan Studies was a movement started on social media that reached elders who don't have social media. And what is that but not a particular power around how stories get carried within a particular community? So when I'm talking about a Somali oral epistemology, what I really mean simply is the ways in which Somalis think, understand, and move, as well as the ideas that we believe to be true and real for Somali communities. And so I'm not referring to just kind of an imagined practice. I'm referring to an imagined practice that is now kind of a concrete reality in the ways that people move. And when I talk about grounding a Somali oral epistemology, it's important that that grounding and that centering of this particular way of thinking is a rejection of kind of a European epistemology that exists right now within Somali studies, right? Nothing comes from nothing. This would be a replacement or another look at a way that we could frame the ways in which we think and move. And the Somali oral epistemology can be the place from which we can theorize new languages, methodologies, and envision a new way forward that centers Somalis. So I'm going to read another quote. I'm a very big fan of quotes because I think there are brilliant people who say very brilliant things in very succinct ways. And this is by Ali Jamale Ahmed, who is, I think, a really incredible Somali scholar. And he said that Somalis are said to be great poets, but they are equally great storytellers. Their stories reflect the kinds of values they cherish. They, for example, put a premium on loyalty, courage, fairness, intelligence, and generosity. Their stories depict the tasks, the preoccupations, and the contradictions that Somali society grapples with and attempts to explain to its members. It is through oral narrative that children are inducted into culture. In Somali oral narratives, form and content are inseparable. A good story comes to life through good storytelling. A performance is enjoyed when the facial contortions and gestures, intonation, and the overall body language of the storyteller harmoniously become one with syntax and construction. In short, the use of language for instruction and entertainment is keenly observed in Somali storytelling sessions. Oral narratives offer solutions to existential problems. They help the community formulate a map, a blueprint of a sort. They also give solace, as they afford the community a valuable insight into the perplexing issues that baffle them. In short, the stories explain how, for example, things have come into being, and why they are what they are. Somali oral narratives are replete with stories that sniff the air in order to explain what is and what is to come. Orality remains a crucial way through which to examine Somali experiences. It's fundamental to the understanding of Somali Nimo. We know of our histories, our legacy, our lineage from story. We could argue that stories are the foundation of who we are as a peoples. Somalis have cultivated and created modes of knowledge transfer that go years beyond whatever it is institutions consider legitimate. The transmission of stories and histories across space, generation, and location has taken place precisely because Somalis have perfected the transmission of stories and histories across space, generation, and location. I'm going to sit up, maybe that'll help. Has taken place precisely because Somalis have perfected an oral scholarship. So how do we make sense of our orality as an epistemology and eventually a methodology through which to better understand ourselves in a more precise and intentional way? The ways in which Somalis are represented are also managed through story. If we look at representation itself as being made up of a number of different stories, we think more broadly about what a story has the power to do, and begin to think of all the narratives that we now understand as story. Positive or negative, stories are relatively neutral and often just reflect the hegemonic states we engage with. Stories are never finished. The representations they frame haunt us years later. A Madiban person shows up in a 1910 text commissioned by the British government on flora and fauna, which is plants and animals, titled The Mammals of Somaliland. Humans showing up in texts about animals produces a particular kind of story that persists today in news articles, one most recently titled, Saving Somalia Again. Our humanity is constantly stripped from us in the text that we consult, even when we're looking to reinsert ourselves back into academic literature. Whether we are written alongside animals or are being saved again, it's the same narrative that continually replays itself. These are not representations that are meaningless and disappear with time. These are representations that become embedded in stories that become the mode through which people begin to communicate and operate and create widespread policy and social conditions for marginalized groups. The Madiban are a group it's lumped in with other minority castes and given 0.5% of a vote in Somalia. Right? What does a text from 1910 do to produce a particular kind of Somali? We are never talking about things that are past and finished. the ways in which Somalis have been represented since the 1600s directly impact foreign policy, ideas of Somalinimo, descriptors like terrorist and pirate, and on it goes. Resistance for Somali communities includes these reconstructions, and storytelling is a place where we can gain valuable information for ourselves as well. Somali orality and storytelling is a site from which valuable information can be gleaned regarding values, social hierarchy, hegemony, the stratification of class, gender, caste, ability, age, and so on. Stories provide access to identity, even when a physical location isn't available or imaginable. Stories where the locations, characters, or animals included no longer make sense for the current social context. They still have value. What's the relevance of the story of the crocodile losing its tongue to the fox for a child who has never seen a crocodile or a fox? When I talk about centering a Somali oral epistemology, I mean that there's a particular way in which orality and the legacy of my Ayeyo and the stories of her Ayeyo's Ayeyo are deeply embedded in my experiences and in my body. I smell cardamom and cloves being put into tea, and I'm reminded of my grandmother telling me about the pots she used to cook her water, to boil her water and cook her food, pots that were gifted to her from another generation's time. I hear Halal Bagan Han Mabuksha, and I'm immediately reminded of tense air diffused by laughter time and time again through proverb and gabe. I hear a drum beat and hands clapping, and I'm reminded of every wedding I've ever been to, every brambor I cheered for, every elder who asked for their family's name to be sung out. I read Somalis are a clannish people in an academic text, and my body seizes. Because who are you to tell me what I am? Who are you to define the way that I walk through life? I read out loud pieces of anthropological record to Somali elders, and they laugh at me and remind me that they were alive during some of that time, and they have stories, and everything written could not possibly have happened. A decolonial process then for me is valuing these experiential processes as equal to, if not more valuable than the Somali-related work a scholar decides to take up as an interest. There is a way in which these stories land on our bodies and have embodied implications for the work that we do. There is a way in which my stakes and investment are far different than those seeking to fulfill an interest. And subsequently, the risks are far greater the more investment that I have. It's my body that's constantly on the line. So as Somalis, how do we center ourselves? How do we control our own narrative and do the work of speaking to narratives that reflect our physical experiences? These are the questions we must ask, even as we reject these distractions from those intent on destroying these very spaces. Centering ourselves does not mean the displacement of anybody else. It just means that my experiences are valuable, our experiences are valuable and deserve to be spoken.
Intellection must not have been coming from literature, because somebody like me coming from African literary studies, I have quite the opposite experience, in terms of so much experience, so much co-presence, with Somali. I mean, the continent has two writers who have been orbiting the Nobel Prize in the last decade. One's a Somalian, one's a Kenyan, I'm talking about Mkuki and Nuruddin Farah, some of the continent's best writers or literary scholars. They are Somalians. But the first thing I wanted us to talk about, just as a way of entry, is because we have these Spivak backcloth we have framed these event using that essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? And as both of you talked, I kept going back to something that's very central to that essay, which is the fact that there is that part about it in which Spivak tries to make those of us who are subalterns speaking as subalterns, for subalterns, as part of, to question our own assumptions, our own privileges, and especially our own location. And part of our argument is that if we don't do that, because she was addressing it basically to the subaltern studies group and also through them to the so-called third world scholar or intellectual who is doing post-colonial studies from privileged locations in the center. And how do we sometimes inadvertently reproduce some of the narratives of power, the mechanisms of power that we are trying to question and deconstruct. And one way in which she thinks we might sometimes do that, and I experience it a lot in my own work with the Nigerian project, because I'm here in Ottawa, but I just won't keep my mouth shut. I won't keep my mouth shut about cultural issues in Nigeria. I won't keep my mouth shut about political issues in Nigeria. I'm always engaging the public, and I get that a lot. Even from the Nigerians back home, who constantly try to delegitimize me by virtue of my location, depending on who I offend. I only just got off from offending a very powerful emir, the emir of Kano, because 2 weeks ago he married his fourth wife, who is 18 years old, and I did an op-ed, and it went so back and forth, cultural war. So, do you both get that in your work? Because that in terms of and so doing that, I'm reminded that Spivak says we should unpack certain things. In your own case, it would be unpacking the Somali. Spivak says if we're subalterns, also, I'm a Nigerian, I talk about it as a Nigerian, I speak as a Nigerian subaltern all the time. And if I unpack that, then I become this privileged, Western located, who is appropriating the voice or the voices of, and that's how sometimes they treat me that way. Those guys in Lagos or Ibadan and all that, they throw things back at me, and all that. So I'm wondering if we unpack the Somali, how does that sort of thing complicate this kind of work that you are doing? And oh, by the way, Adan Studies, right? The C is silent. Adan Studies.
Yes.
Okay. And the only thing I have to say to that is that you have both empowered me and given me a voice, because we go to these conferences and then, this post-colonial studies thing, it's passé, you've been screaming for, said what Said did this thing in 1979, you've been screaming and all that. And then you come to a thing like this, because ever since this was convened, I've read up on it, this is a brand new frontier of knowledge that's been, I can go to the African Literature Association and say, tell me it's passé. Have you heard of Adan Studies? We are just starting. So it's not passé at all. So thank you very much for it. It's absolutely wonderful. I feel empowered. I feel rejuvenated in terms of the things that we do. So you don't have to answer my rambling now. Let's insert reactions into, because I want the audience to, I know you're all raring to go because it's so what we'll do is 2 questions each for them. We'll stop and let them really engage, and then we'll take the next 2 if you, okay. And I'm very happy that my sister and colleague Kamari is here raring to go. Professor.
Great. Thank you, Pius, and of course thank you to the presenters for 2 phenomenal presentations. Of course, there's a lot to say here. You've all raised questions having to do with power, gatekeeping, epistemology, disciplining and the disciplining of knowledge as well as practices. But I actually, in taking up Pius's call on us to reflect on the newness of this, because obviously those of us outside of the debate often hear people say, okay, we've been there 20 years ago, we've been there 25 years ago, we saw this 40 years ago in whether it's African American studies or Black studies, etc. And that's not the case at all. So I appreciate the chair's mark of establishment of the extent to which this is a contemporary intervention, and in fact it has a place, and an important place. And in part, my question is about the newness of social media and what that does as a modality for the speaking that Spivak described long before social media and Twitter was even conceptualized. And I wonder if you could comment on the irony that's at play here, because in fact, the modality, part of the frustration is that the initiator, so Safia, in your case, you initiated a set of debates, but once it left, you couldn't control what it became. Some of it contravened your initial position, some supported, some moved in a different direction. Some of the comments you wouldn't support with your eyes closed. And some, in fact, even accentuated and emphasized much of what you said and brought it further. And so Hawa's point that there's something about storytelling as a modality, in fact, is part of the irony that I wanted to highlight and ask you to comment on, because in fact storytelling speaks to a kind of narrative, a linear, perhaps not linear, it may be circular, it might be dialogic, but it does speak to a purpose. There is something being communicated, there are relationships, there are a whole set of things that have to do with the past, the future, the present, all of them combined. But they're not the same as the kind of assemblage that is social media, that is erratic, that's what we call rhizomatic in social theory, that actually becomes all sorts of things, but ultimately it reflects back on the initiator. So the hashtag that started the conversation is always what it turns back to, but the conversation went and became many other things. And so I wonder if you can comment on the nature of this modality and what the implications are, both in terms of its power as well as the ability to lose control of the message. Because in many ways, Hawa left us with the call to center. How do we center ourselves? How do we think strategically and politically about the message, about what it is our intervention should be? But the modality that is social media, in fact, is far more erratic where that's concerned. So if you can comment on that.
Okay, yes.
I'd like to echo Mari's comments and really thank you for presentations that had such rich, specific details, close readings, analytical rigor, particularly how you approached coloniality, professionalization, and the digital humanities. But I'd probably like to approach it from a slightly different aspect. So whereas Kamari's asking you to think about the contemporary conjuncture, I was particularly struck by how the terms you use, like fight, like violence, that impact our lived experiences, can be informed by historical context and examples. I'll just give a couple of examples. I'm thinking, for example, about the way in which your presentations about the ostracization of the young, the emotional, the insurgent intellectual, as against the older, rational, critical scholar, speak to attempts to delegitimize Black studies in the 1960s as overly emotional, militant, didactic, in opposition to privileged professors in elite universities, and with access to the mainstream media, who talked about the unrewarding gyrations of Africans that could only amuse, i.e. they titillate, but not serious knowledge. I'm also thinking about this in terms of the way in which folks who consider themselves very progressive in the 1980s, when he used the phrase jumping in through the window or breaking the window, it's a very striking metaphor that Stuart Hall used as well in the 1980s, when he was talking about nice progressive males who thought that they could open a door and let feminists in. And what did feminists do? They jumped in through the window because they felt that they had to reframe the debate. And last but not least, that really led me into not so much an infamous comment of Stuart Hall, but a really productive comment, which Hawa's ending spoke so beautifully to, is that centering Somali studies does not mean that other voices are silenced. And the comment for Hall is always that allowing previously marginalized groups to speak does not mean that previously dominant groups are silenced. So I was just thinking about if you connect reading your specific stories out of context, to draw those connections to historical examples.
Maybe you'll take this too.
Sure. So I was also struck by Hawa's intervention and the idea of centering Somalis. I think then that speaks to the idea that there can be multiple centers, and the resistance of this is this certain idea. This is very much what's been theorized in terms of the kind of decolonial studies, coloniality, the idea that there is a one universal, there is a one center, there's a one truth, and that one is European, and that's what we call Eurocentrism. So what I think this is doing is destabilizing that. It's decentering, it's deconstructing the idea that there's a one claim and one monopoly to truth and knowledge, and then by introducing, and I mean, so much to theorize then from what would a Somali vantage point look like, what would a Somali epistemology look like. So I think that work is to be done, but what I think of Adan Studies is doing is opening up that critical space to do that work, I mean, with the intervention. Thank you for mentioning the historical examples, because just the other day I was reading a document. It was published in the Negro Digest, which is not, obviously doesn't exist anymore, but this is in 1970, talking about the 1969 protest by Black scholars at the African Studies Association conference in Montreal. So this was, I mean, it was written by, I think, John Clark. So at the time they had a Black caucus and kind of this idea that an incredible manifesto that I would encourage you all to read, and making claims of for increased African and African diasporic representation in the institutional structure of the African Studies Association. Also a very interesting critique of coloniality before, you know, it was named coloniality. This idea that knowledge is being produced in the service of the West, a critique of area studies and how it's emerged in that idea that these are fundamentally the idea that there's something fundamentally against African interests in kind of knowledge production about Africa that takes place in the West and is controlled by then kind of mostly Euro-American gatekeepers. So it was incredible for me, actually jarring to see that's what I'm saying now in 2015 about Somali studies is what was being said by Black scholars in 1969. So that goes to show that, I mean, a lot of this is still taking place now. I think the circulation of the open letter is also a testament to how these questions are still very much in other area studies fields. People were able to recognize it immediately, you know, and see the issues there. So I am going to then get to, I think, Dr. Clark's comment about the newness and social media as a dynamic. I think social media has been incredible for this, because I think it's enabled people who would otherwise not be able to participate in the discourse to engage, people who are outside of the academy to engage and question the academy and think about the university and what the university means to them, if anything, to think about what Somali Studies is, to reveal that Somali Studies exists. For many people, they did not realize that Somali Studies was even a thing, that they didn't know that there was a congress that was taking place in Helsinki. I met a number of people in Helsinki who said, hey, I heard about it because of Twitter, and I'm here because of that, you know. So otherwise kind of closed spaces that would be mostly Euro-American practitioners speaking to each other were all of a sudden revealed. And I think part of why it disturbs a lot of people then is because I'm not always talking to them. You know, it's not taking place in this closed space. I'm interacting with, and we're interacting with other Somali people, other folks outside of academic spaces. The idea that the audio was public then, in the interest of complete transparency and access, disturbed, I think, a lot of folks who wanted to keep it as this closed room. So you're right that it does, I think, it can get crazy on Twitter. A lot of people can participate, a lot of people can say things I don't agree with, but I think that's the point. I love that. You know, I don't have to agree with that, and it shouldn't reflect on me, although many people have framed it as, you know, look at what Safia's unleashed on someone, you know. So, but I think that's fine. I think I'm responsible for what I've said and what I've written. I think I'm working in a different space than some other people. I'll continue to do my academic work, and I think it should be judged on that and not, you know, what the Twitter egg tweets about Somali studies or about other folks. So, but I think it's interesting. I think also on the newness point, I think although many of these debates and discussions have taken place in post-colonial studies and subaltern studies and other fields, I do think we have kind of new material, a new place from which to do that theorizing. We can theorize those epistemologies. We can think about kind of the world in a post 9/11, kind of post. So all of these things taking place in the Somali territories are very unique and interesting, and very different than, for example, you know, thinking about kind of the canon of colonial India as the Subaltern Studies Collective would have been revisiting. There's a lot that's new there, and significantly there's the other sites of knowledge production, not just the academy as an institution, but, you know, the NGOs, the security complex. All of these things are also taking place, and also, I think, worth thinking about and talking about. So we have something there, I think, that could be a new addition to kind of what can be under the umbrella of post-colonial studies or decolonial studies.
Yeah, so I do want to comment on a few things. So one of the ways that I became directly implicated in Adan Studies very early, and I say implicated because there's a way in which it's just kind of taken off, and I'd say Safia is definitely the brunt of the attacks, which we frequently talk about and what that means in particular, was that I wrote an op-ed specifically to Marcus Honay, talking about white colonial scholarship, to which he responded to. It was the direct critique of white supremacy that was like, he was like, I gotta say something about this thing. I'll also say that the conversation happening on Facebook, without shame, I screenshotted it and put it on Twitter. Absolutely. Because I was curious what other Somalis, and so this is the interesting part. I've been on Twitter since 2012, and social media has this particular resonance at that particular point in time that it wasn't serious, and people weren't necessarily engaging with it authentically, and it was just a bunch of people behind screens tweeting things at each other that didn't know each other and weren't saying anything legitimate. I'm very fascinated by Twitter, particularly because the Somali diaspora is literally across the globe, and it's a relatively new diaspora, and Somali Twitter was a thing. Like, Somalis engaging with one another about what was happening in the territories, outside the territories, was like they were frequently engaging with one another. Whether it meant like hating on one another or loving each other, they were engaging with conversations in a way, and then in kind of a nonprofit world, an academic life, that people were saying directly Somalis weren't engaging at all. And so I found that really curious, that I was seeing this crop of young Somali folks fully engaged with what was happening around what they perceived to be connected to them, and then this other world where people were saying Somalis aren't engaging at all. So I was fundamentally curious with what would happen if we were to take these incredibly racist remarks that he felt really strongly about to post on social media and put it on Twitter. What would people say? What would people's reactions be? And what would a production of that be? I don't think ever I would have imagined that Adan Studies would have been the result of that. And I think there's something about public shaming within the space of academia that has a usefulness, because it encourages a kind of transparency, and it reminds people that, no, you can't just write whatever you want, publish it, and consider it fact. You're accountable to a group of people who then read that and believe it to be fact. You're accountable for what comes from you. And you can't hide behind the academic jargon for too long. You should actually have that information be put as widely as possible so people can engage with it. And so, Dr. Cog, I don't actually think fundamentally storytelling is different from that. I think, in fact, there were I think Adan Studies as a hashtag constructed a particular story that's really useful for the intervention that we were looking to make, that several folks were looking to make. And I think people had different ideas and interpretations of what that story looked like, but there was a dominant story around what Adan Studies was looking to do. Because if there wasn't, how is that particular narrative picked up by so many people and deeply understood? So I don't think the storytelling strays too far from that premise. I think it makes it much less controllable. But I think also Somali orality is very difficult to control in and of itself. The story might be the exact same, but the person's look or the person's physical kind of cringe gives away their tone, the tone that they're sharing with that particular story. So, and I think all of that is what makes storytelling a beautiful place from which to start some of these conversations, is that you're ensured that no one's coming in assuming that the story means the same thing for everybody. It has different connotations as we go through. And then I just wanted to, lots of my reading stems from movements in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, particularly around movements that engage with Black people, African diaspora folks. And before Adan Studies, so I started my master's degree in September of 2015.
Too much history.
Too much history.
Physically.
And this hadn't happened, right? So this Adan Studies, now I'm in a perfect place. I'm like, this is precisely what I needed to have happen so that I can actually do my work with any kind of integrity, in my opinion, because the work that I was looking to do was to rebuttal lots of the things in the canon of Somali studies. And the fact that this is, not that it wasn't happening before, but that it's become centralized, now becomes a really great place to work from. But we're always just replicating the same movements. It's a contemporary time, it's a different social condition, but the premise is the same, is that we're looking to speak to white supremacy, ongoing colonialism, capitalism, imperialism. Like those particular pieces haven't changed. The ways in which we're doing it, I think our modes and the modes in which we engage now change. So I think the further back we read, the more useful our strategies become, because had I not read or known about some of the movements that were happening in that time, would I have screen capped a comment made by a German professor and intentionally put it on Twitter? I don't know.
So it becomes a changing state.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Also, I think it made it obvious how problematic these things were. I mean, for him it wasn't obvious, and now going back on it, I realized that continental Europe has a very different kind of trajectory of how these things developed, you know, completely, for him, lacking literacy in, you know, kind of critical race studies and understanding what structural racism is, and even being aware of, what's curious to me too is, as an anthropologist, I mean, knowing the kind of the debates then that were taking place in anthropology in the 1960s, not aware of that at all. Kind of Talal Assad's intervention of, you know, anthropology and the colonial encounter, none of it is there in many parts of Europe. I learned recently they don't even have, I'm in the middle of doing kind of my IRBs for fieldwork and things like that. They don't have that in many parts of Europe. No ethical reviews of projects. They just go in there and kind of go on to do their research. So, I mean, it's also then different institutional histories, I think, that was taking place. It was very much kind of me and others being grounded in academia in North America, which is more, I mean, social theory has more of a place in many of the departments, certainly for me in history, and kind of being kind of in between history and anthropology in my work. But for many people then in Europe, and where that's where a lot of the knowledge being produced about the Somali territories is, in many cases, unfortunately taking place, many people are not aware of these things. So there's kind of that speaking two different languages, coming up against each other in that way, and rejecting some ideas that we take for granted in many North American departments have never been heard before in Germany or Finland or other places. So there was also that. So for us, I mean, we're very much aware of kind of the historical development of area studies, the debates that have been taking place, social theory. For many others, it was very new. Yeah.
And then we move to that. Yeah, so let's go ahead.
I'd like to thank you, both of you, very much for this really rich set of presentation. As you said, it really opens up a different way of thinking, not only about Somalia, but about the general problem as a whole. You problematized the construction of knowledge, and this has been an ongoing problem. What I'd like to do is to come at it from the perspective of ignorance. In my work, I've been particularly influenced by a short article that was written by Edward Said 6 weeks after 9/11 in the Nation magazine, where the title of the article was "The Clash of Ignorance," and he was playing on Samuel Huntington's book, "The Clash of Civilizations," but sort of turning it on its head as a problem in which there is ignorance, perhaps mutual ignorance, between the Western and Muslim worlds and China, and basically the kind of scenario that Huntington had created. But the issue here is, and this is the question I'd like to pose to you, are these two sides of the coin, knowledge and ignorance? And the way that certain kinds of knowledge are posited, whether it's about Somalia or Africa as a whole, the way that knowledge is constructed in the academy, in the West, and in other places, you know, the critique that Spivak and Said and so on have presented about it being in the handmaiden of imperialism, of colonialism, to justify invasion and control of territory and of people and resources and etc. Is it done, is this knowledge really ignorance in the guise of knowledge? And is the work that is being done now through post-colonial critiques a pushing back of this? Is it creating new knowledge? Is it a different form of knowledge? I'm quite intrigued about even the title that you have given to your studies, Adan Studies, and you mentioned that it means white in Somali. And so is that a subversion of sorts, a symbolic subversion, in the strategic ways in which the new knowledge is being presented? And lastly, we've spoken about social media and new media, but what about the old media which still have tremendous power, like film, for example? And I'm particularly thinking of that film, I forget the name of the movie, with Tom Hanks.
Oh, Captain Phillips.
Yes. And what was the response of the Somali community to that? I don't want to generalize, of course, but how was it played out on social media? How was that response played out on social media in presenting another form of knowledge about those circumstances?
Do you mind introducing yourself?
Yes, my name is Kareem. I teach in the School of Journalism and Communication.
Thanks, yeah.
Thank you. And I'm Monica Patterson. I'm a professor in the Institute of Interdisciplinary Studies. I just wanted to say, to start, how inspired I am by what you've presented. And what strikes me is the incredible agility with which you both are moving across these domains that are often kept separate. So we talk a lot about the differences between academia and the general public, personal and professional lives, the hierarchy between students and the old guard and the established professoriate. And I see you moving across these different genres also of thought and of action and movement. So you mentioned you wrote an op-ed, which I think is fantastic. The way that you really quite powerfully mobilize multiple forms of social media. And as an American, I was especially appreciative of your reference to the Black Lives Matter phenomenon, which I think has a lot of resonance with the work that you both have done. So my question is, it's clear that you already have made a huge impact in terms of the research and the academic side of things, but I was wondering if you have some advice or some goals or future dreams, and if you'd like to share with us if you're thinking about some strategic solidarities and kind of activist approaches that can be used in forging these connections, particularly in this context as we're nearing the political election period and debates around the niqab, for instance, are being mobilized in certain ways and references to proper old stock Canadian bread. So thanks for that.
To say nothing of barbaric value.
Yeah. Oh, right, I forgot that one.
Yeah, maybe I'll start. So, Mandep is ongoing, right? Like this is it's a platform. It's a series of articles and posts written that are relatively short, right? We're talking 400 to 800 words, and we're talking a podcast that happens once every month that features a variety of different Somali demics, whatever that looks like. And I mean, we're also constantly moving through what it means to be an academic. There are folks that do community organizing that come on and speak. There are folks that we consider to be specialists in the work that they do, constantly coming in and speaking. There's a collective that manages it. There's rotating editors. There's a pretty, I think, last I checked, there's like 2,000 likes. We've been open since July, and we produce very minimal content. Like, quite frankly, because everyone's managing what they're managing, and we produce what we can, but we produce minimal content. And I say this in comparison to other things. So, I think so, and I want to be careful too that while this is really great, it's not unique. It's not unique. The only, I think the only thing that, it's just the ways that in which we mobilized, I think, that struck people, because it happened relatively quick. And I mean, I'm sure not taking credit for it. I think lots of young Somali folks who are heavily engaged in social media deserve the majority of the credit for the ways in which these things have been taken up. And it just mobilized relatively quickly. But people have been doing this work for quite some time, and I want to be, and part of, for me, moving back and forth between a number of different movements is because if we're really looking at the construction of power, then we can't afford to get stuck in the special floweredness of our own situations, right? And I use special flower because Somali UK uses special flower all the time. This is a shout out for them. But we're not special, and what happens is that when we believe ourselves to be this special marginalized group over here doing incredibly innovative work and sell ourselves as that, we forget that other people are doing equally as innovative work, and actually the strategy is to cross-discipline, and the strategy is to disrupt power in the places that we can. I said this yesterday, and I continue saying it. At this rate, I'm never getting into a PhD program. Absolutely never. Because I have zero regard for what it means to be an old guard or a new guard. Absolutely zero regard. I firmly believe that I can walk into a classroom, read the same text as everybody else, and tell you I don't enjoy it, I don't want to read it, and I want something else. And, you know, Dr. Clark can testify to that. And I believe that, and it's not a belief in my own special floweredness or brilliance. It's a belief that all of us are engaged in the work of knowledge production, every single one of us. And the stories my grandmother tells me is knowledge production. And what I'm resisting is the idea that someone else can do that for me and I'm never allowed to then engage, right? So I think if we can work to produce those kinds of ideas, and I say this to young Somali folks I see all the time, like, it's as much yours as it belongs to anybody else. It's Somali studies. You have every right to contest what comes in and what comes out. As young black folks walking through the world, you have every right to contest what comes your way and what then leaves. Like, this is yours. Because it's your body that's implicated when somebody else does the damage. Whether or not people realize it, it's you that gets shot at, kicked out of classrooms, gets mile-long attacks that beep on your phone from Twitter. Like, these are all things that come at cost and come at risk. And so I think when we start to look at that, we start to have a better sense of what we're doing isn't all that special. Contesting power isn't a new concept. It's a relatively old one. And, you know, our idea of knowledge within an academic setting, yes, I'd say is definitely a handmaid into imperialism. But I really want to get at what we believe to be knowledge, right? I think it's too easy, and I hate to contest Edward Said because, you know, that's a hard one. It's too easy to say that it's too easy to use the justification of ignorance when people also benefit from that very ignorance. Like, who does it not benefit to, on the flip side of, oh, that you just didn't know, whose body does that then impact?
No, it's not ignorance, it's not knowing. It's the active construction of knowledge, but it's false knowledge.
Absolutely, but I will argue, exactly, and I will argue that, so that's semantics a little bit, I will argue though that we do know. It's why we turn off our TV when we've heard too many people have died, or we stop paying attention after a certain amount, or we say things like, oh, if my research is in Africa for the next 3 months, I'll get a ton of money. We do know. At some level, we do know, and so my argument is that it's too easy to pretend you don't, because I think as human beings, for the most part, we do know. And I really want to contest that we don't. Because if we allow, and I used to say this to young people all the time, right? If we believe that they're not capable of knowing, then we give them the out before they've even begun, right? But if we look at them and say, actually, it's your duty to know, in the same way that it's my duty to contest you, then we immediately come to a place where we can have a conversation about it. So that's mine. Safia might be like, how is crazy?
I wonder sometimes if there isn't a certain agency in deciding not to know. I got to a point where I started thinking, wait a minute, I watch Fox News. I pay my money to watch Fox News. So I decided to cancel that subscription. So I can't pay to watch this thing. And it's like, why should I pay? And if I enter your business and I'm going to buy stuff from you and I see Fox News, if you don't change the channel, and I'm not spending my money, and it could be a form of ignorance, because sometimes it's good to know what those guys are saying. But sometimes I'm not paying to know. If it's free, fine. But if it's not free, I'm not paying my money. So that's strategic ignorance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a really interesting question, one that, it's a thick question, I think, and one that I still need to work through, because I've been thinking about kind of these questions that have been posed. Can the subaltern speak? I'm reading a really great book right now called Can the Non-European Think? Which is incredible, by Hamid Dabashi at Columbia. So it's, I mean, this idea then, and I think here's where it's relevant, the idea that then knowledge is only generated by some, and that the Somali then is rendered as a person who is unable to produce knowledge. So it's a question of, I think, then how certain knowledges, or one knowledge, becomes universal. This idea that kind of knowledge production is engaged in producing certain representations of Somali people in the Somali territories, and those become dominant and defended is what we're kind of seeing now. The idea that, that can be critiqued, that can be dislodged, that there are other ways of understanding, that is partial knowledge, is something that's, I think, I wouldn't even say it's that's where I disagree with you. I don't think it's too easy. I think there's a lot of labor that goes into defending those representations. It's it's unexplainable in some ways, but at the same time, I mean, you're losing your monopoly over a field. That's what's happening.
It's the resistance
you face.
It's
the resistance, exactly. It's the idea that they're being rendered partial, when the Somali before that was the one who was partial. They were the realm of kind of truth and knowledge and centering that. The idea that they're not universal anymore and not dominant, I think, is a resistance we're seeing. So there's some interesting work, I think. I've lately kind of stepped a little bit away from African studies, and I've kind of, we're in dialogue with, I think, as Africanists, often South Asian studies, the Edward Said's, the Spivaks and whatnot, but I think Latin America has some very interesting insights to offer. Many theorists there have taken post-colonial studies a step further to look at decolonizing and decolonial knowledge, and then kind of very much getting in the question of kind of generating new epistemologies and ontologies, understanding that there are ways of knowing that are beyond that. And I mean, the critique then of subaltern studies in other fields is that they're kind of, I don't want to say reversing, and that's something that Spivak's very careful to do, but unintentionally uses, the Deleuze's and Foucault's, and you're still speaking the same language. Whereas others like Walter Mignolo and others are trying to get away from that in Latin America. I think then it's interesting. And then their answer actually, and Walter Mignolo does an introduction to Hamid Dabashi's book, and says, yes, we can think. Yes, we can speak. We're just speaking differently, and the point is the recognition of that different knowledge and different way of speaking is a question. So it's an interesting take then, on someone like Spivak, who was writing in, I think, 1985 was when she asked that question. Yes.
We have 5 minutes, so maybe 2 short questions. No, 5 minutes for this segment. Or are we following? We're following.
No, it's something.
Oh,
so
good. Okay, so let's relax. I'm not in the house. Okay, so please go ahead.
Sorry?
Can I just say something?
Oh yes,
really
you
quick?
continue with the segment.
Oh, okay, because I'm.
Can I just say something really quickly? One of the things I've been profoundly interested in, Monica, is bridging the activist and the academic. That's something that I'm profoundly interested in. And what it means to walk as a graduate student, very vocal graduate student in a room full of people. And I didn't do my undergrad, right? So this is also a very interesting position that I hold, because I walk into classrooms and say, what does Foucault have to teach me that I could not learn from somebody else? What is the purpose and intention of Spivak? What is new about this that's useful for me? And I think that's different than, I think there's a particular kind of training, I think, that happens in undergrad. And so it's a different look when I walk in and when people are quoting Foucault, and I can say, well, I don't know him. What does he do? Tell me more about this. And so it's a different piece. And so I think I'm always thinking, what use does this bring to my community? What value added is this? And I'm always thinking about, and I think we talk about this a lot with Mandel too, how do we make something that people intentionally make very complicated and make it very clear, so that the most amount of people have access to the most amount of information possible.
Okay, so we'll take another set of questions. Okay, 1, 2, 3. We can actually just slide.
Why should a young Somali person going on about their life care about all this? Like, how does this impact the day-to-day living of a young Somali person, be it Canadian, American, British, or in the Horn?
Go ahead.
Oh yes. So I have 2 questions. One is, Somali colonial knowledge production had a grandfather, in my opinion, but I wanted to ask about. Sorry. I am Louis. Is it fair to say that he, and I don't expect you to answer it to, don't want to, but is it fair to say that he was the grandfather of Somali colonial knowledge production? That's one question. And the second question that I would ask Safia, when you were talking earlier about the impact of this kind of knowledge on the actual lives of people. So I'm thinking about actually the actual lives of the Somali people now. But I mean as a country in general, and how it's used actually to regulate certain things that's happening in the old country. So that to speak to that, if you have any thinking about it.
I will take yours.
It's funny, we're the ladies of Sahan, so it was just a coincidence that we spoke. But I just wanted to, following up on Ikram's question about the grandfathers.
Louder.
Louder.
The grandfathers of Somali studies. What has been your engagement with the older established scholars of Somali studies, right? Because Somali studies has existed, I don't know, since the 60s, is it? 70s, 80s?
78
Since
was
70s.
when they launched it, actually. 1978.
So what has been the reaction of sort of Adan Studies, if you've had any? And Hawa, since you're a storyteller, are you going to tell a story? Can you tell a story?
I could, yeah.
Yeah, great.
You should.
Okay, yeah, we'll come back to the story
Yeah.
then.
Yeah.
Okay, first on the grandfathers, because that's an interesting question. So I am Lewis, started his research in British Somaliland. Those of you who are not familiar with him, he is kind of the historically speaking, the major anthropologist of Somali studies, and you could also say a historian. So did his work, his field work, with funding from the British Somaliland Protectorate, the Colonial Office, and he was a graduate student in, I think, was it Oxford? I want to say. He was a professor at the LSE, but he did his PhD work at Oxbridge, one of those. So, you know, he did his field work, yeah, one of the schools. He did his field work then in British Somaliland, kind of doing research on kinship and clan, which is very much kind of the preoccupation of you know, colonial anthropology. This idea that Somalis are inherently clannish people and trying to look at kind of the clan structure. So a lot of his work was not necessarily bad. I mean, useful for its time, was also very interesting. He did some really interesting studies of religion and kind of spirit possession and things like that, but most people know him specifically for his work on clan. The problem is that his models for clan are still very much the dominant ideas of Somali society today. Fine for, you know, the structural functionalists, you know, of the 1950s, but certainly in 2015, no business being kind of the dominant mode of understanding and interpreting Somali social life. How I think this figures in also to how knowledge is used then to regulate certain things and why this matters. I think these are all interrelated questions. This idea that Somalis are essentially clannish people have implications for policy. These exist with the NGOs that are doing work on the ground, for the governments that are doing work with the Somali state. So this idea figures into their imagination. It shapes the relationship and interaction with Somali people there. All of these things then matter. That knowledge is translated into the actual policies that are produced, the ways things are enacted, how it's analyzed. The media still very much understands Somalis as tribal fighting people, will impose those interpretations even when that doesn't make sense. If you actually look at it, it's okay, whatever, the same groups are fighting each other within groups. Sometimes they'll portray it as two different clans that are fighting, when really it's the same. Any Somali person might see that, and it's actually people within the same clan. But this mode is over this. Someone asked a question about also Captain Phillips and other, these are all kind of part of that imagination that's produced then in research work. I haven't seen Captain Phillips yet. I refuse to on principle. I only just recently watched Black Hawk Down, which is not that long, quite a while ago. But in general, media is another. I think Hollywood media is another issue where it can be much worse in many cases. But I am Lewis. His role is very much. He's been canonized as kind of the founding father of Somali studies. And part of that is because of the scarcity of work during the period. He was very much one of the early people who were writing about Somalis at that time, in at least an academic way. There have always been, the Richard Burdens and the explorers and the travel journals, but to try and study Somali society in a systematic way. So he became the canon. The issue then is that while we have had critiques, it hasn't been displaced in that way, not in the way that, contemporary anthropology, you can you can read the classics and we know the critiques of them, but I Am Lewis is still very much read unproblematically, and his model is still very much used. Actually, only a few years ago, a book in his honor came out, edited by Marcus and others. But there was a book, and one of the quotes on the back says, this is a collection of the who's who in Somali studies, writing essays in honor of I Am Lewis. And I learned also not that long ago, but some of the critical essays were actually excluded from that. This was a decision on the part of the editors of that edited collection. So you can see how much of a hold, we called it on MedDef, the ghosts of I Am Lewis still has over Somali studies. Is there anything I didn't touch on? Why should Somalis care? Again, these things have everyday consequences. So I spoke a little bit about kind of things, how it takes place in the Horn, but knowledge is produced about the Somali diaspora also. Something that was really interesting to me, and I didn't touch on this when I was talking about the Helsinki Congress, but part of their reason for not including the Adan Studies critiques was that they said that we feel that the program is set, we owe sort of roundtables and keynotes to our funders. And so, it just shows the imperatives of kind of the organizing there, that they couldn't make space because it was owed to certain funding agencies in Europe, that there would be a roundtable on, for example, extremism among, Somalis in the diaspora and whatnot. So it tells you what the funding, where the funding is, where research is funded, and those have consequences then in shaping policy and how the Somali diaspora is then received. So this happens in North America, this happens in Europe. Europe especially, I think it's fascinating how large-scale research projects are then done by researchers who work for these governments. It's a different world over there in some ways, but you see a lot of these things also taking place in North America.
One of the things I'm most interested in doing in my final master's research is contesting a lot of the stuff that I Am Lewis has produced. There's very few, if any, contestations about what he's done. And I think there's something very important to actually note about I Am Lewis. His research was done primarily in British Somaliland and is used to account for the entire Somali territories. That's very important because we're talking a huge amount of the Somali territories that's being encapsulated in research done on a very small segment of Somali population. Right? So for folks who are from the South, that research, for the most part, whatever colonial records, they're in Italian, and very few, if any people, again, have dug through the archives. Right? So there's a gap. And I think it really does come back to these conversations around whose knowledge is produced, because knowledge was always being produced in the Somali territories. Always. Right? There was a huge amount lost, absolutely, during the Civil War in terms of archives, but oral histories still remain, and there's been very few attempts to document and speak to and critically engage with those oral histories. Which is interesting considering that if you, so I was working with a group of Somali elders last term and asked them particular stories, and all of them remembered the story verbatim. There's barely any, if any, differences between the stories. And this is something that I think Somali scholars and non-Somali scholars have engaged with frequently as kind of footnotes or a gabe to start the beginning of your dissertation. But there's been no real kind of engagement with that kind of knowledge production. So I find that interesting. Why should young Somalis care? I mean, we end up carrying it, whether or not we realize it. We end up carrying it, right? The policies being made in Somalia right now are a direct reflection of academic literature published in the 1950s. Like that, for me, as a young Somali person who's also Madiban, so from a minority clan, the government policies being made around who's allowed to vote and who's not allowed to vote is being done based on research from I Am Lewis in the 1950s. So if I were able to go back to Somalia today, I'm given half a vote in comparison to a full vote. And that's directly connected to anthropological work done. So that I have every reason to contest what seems to be a canon, because that canon directly impacts my life, right? Even in the ways that patriarchy is immediately written into Somali discourse as inevitable,
Somali community members used to justify ongoing patriarchy. We have a direct, everything that's written has a direct impact on the ways that we live our lives. Even knowing the history of Islam coming to the Somali territories changes what you wear or what you don't wear, what pressures are being put on you by your families, by your culture groups. Like, these are all things that directly implicate your life. And some of that is because we don't know these things, because we don't have, and not because we don't know because we're not interested, but because we don't have access to the kind of information and the kind of theorizing that I think we're all doing in some way, shape, or form. But to do it in a collective, in a very intentional way, changes the way we can potentially live our lives. So, I mean, I'm constantly speaking to young Somalis. We have a huge investment in how this moves forward, because it directly impacts us. So, and not just young Somalis, this is also older generations of Somalis, right? So my family moved, one of the reasons we moved from Ontario to British Columbia, and I grew up on the West Coast, is because we were one of the first Somali families here. But the amount of discrimination my father faced as a Madiban Somali within the Somali community made him make a decision to leave rather than remain, so that we wouldn't have to act, we wouldn't be treated in a particular way. Like, this has a lot to do with what Ayan Lewis said about the Madiban people. Which stories he collected, which stories he deliberately chose not to collect. Not just him. There are scholars writing in the 1900s who said the same things, right? So we don't know what else could have happened had there been a different kind of academic rigor imposed on the ways people are doing their work. But we can change the ways in which stories are documented and histories are documented moving forward. We have a role in that, and we can change subsequently what next generations then are faced with. If we're letting folks, I mean, I just want to say it's a scary prospect. If we're letting folks in Somali studies write our histories right now, we're going to have a hell of a time in 40 years, a hell of a time, because they're writing us in as pirates, terrorists, jilbab-wearing, machete-carrying, people who gun each other down in the streets for no reason. That's the historical legacy that's being written about us now. This is what we face every time we reject the narratives and we're shut down. That's the kind of stakes we're talking about with this, right? So yeah, I'm down with Ayan Lewis. I read his stuff, and whether or not it's useful, and I do think there is something to be said around, oh, and I should also say, Ayan Lewis's first published paper, he quoted his undergrad papers. He quoted his own undergrad papers. This is the man being told to us runs the canon of Somali studies. He quoted his own research. Like, that takes a particular kind of self-congratulatoriness. Okay, so that's really all I wanted to say.
Story.
Yes, the story. But
yeah, we'll round up with the story. We should really, so we can, Blair?
Keep going. I have to leave myself, but that's okay.
Okay.
We have another
So,
event I have to get to. Sorry.
Yeah, maybe another 2 questions, and then and then we'll listen to a story.
Thank you, Safia and Hawa. I just want to also kind of build on what you were saying and bring it back to the Somali, within the Somali knowledge production or contested. It's really, I appreciated how you say the agility with which they move. I think being young and then talking to elder Somalis has its own challenges in itself, not just in academia, but in just engaging with those very societal structural inequalities that how you mentioned. So how, it's not new, right? It's not new, we know this, it's a contested area. We've been kind of engaging in all different ways of contesting it. And what I am hoping for this to come out of #Adan Studies is a serious sort of paradigm shift, not just disrupting the Ayan Lewis's of Somali studies, but also disrupting the very much hierarchical and sort of structural violences, if you will, that our narratives and some of our stories have. So, the questions that I I get from people who want to critique the hashtag Adan Studies is what is new? They're not telling us anything new, and how would you shift that paradigm? So becoming a Somali scholar that is young, that is utilizing Somali media, even dislodging some of the older Somali sort of traditional ways of framing this thing, whether it's misinformed by the wrong canons of colonial studies, but also within us, we've got issues to really unpack and deconstruct. What would you say to somebody who is an older Somali traditionalist, whatever it is, that says to you, nothing you're saying is new? What is the new paradigm you're bringing? Because it's a form of dismissing you with age, dismissing you with, the gender thing, the Somali clan hierarchy. There's all kinds of barriers. So just bringing your thinking within, because I've been part of Somali studies for a while, and it's very much contested. No matter what you say or how brilliant you say it, it's who you are. You're from Clan X and you're totally dismissed. And we know that, right? So it's frustrating sometimes that and I don't think it's a Somali thing, it could be an African thing too. It's, who's speaking? Is it a Luo man, or is it a Kikuyu man, or who's speaking? And the entire message then gets lost. So how do we begin to challenge that, and contest that within us communities' ways of not taking this seriously? Sorry, if it was too long.
Are you just taking one?
Are we taking more than one question, or?
One more? Okay.
Can I just add to this,
Okay.
so it's still one question, but I think that the answer to the way we engage that really wonderfully articulated question is connected to I.M. Lewis, because it's not simply that I.M. Lewis as anthropologist is responsible for his rendition of that history. Yes, indeed, he's responsible, but as the last speaker mentioned, the power structures that are in play also made viable access to particular clans and people. And so to think about knowledge production and academic and political knowledge production is also to think about the way it's embedded in these relations that are all too familiar to us. And so I think in answering that, it's quite useful to think about it in relation to I.M. Lewis and how they work together.
And just to tag on, Hawa mentioned, rightly so, and I.M. Lewis just researching a particular community in the north, but I.M. Lewis talked to only men. In that community, and had male interpreters, and Somali culture was being fed to him through Somali men in that context.
Hey, let's have these.
It's a really interesting question, which also reminded me that I didn't answer Hodan's question of which elders have been supportive also in Somali studies. The reception actually very early on, Lee Casanelli, who was one of the founding members of the Somali Studies International Association, still around, was part of, I think although he isn't he's based in the United States, but was involved in talking to the organizers directly in Helsinki, sent a very thoughtful, long letter to the organizers. This was within a few weeks of this happening, saying, we need to make space for this. This is very important. This is in the spirit of the founding of the Somali Studies International Association, which was between Somali and non-Somali scholars. He proposed a structure where there would be a round table at the end of each day with young Somali scholars moderated by one of the elders like him. And no one responded to him at all. No one listened to him. As far as the organizers go, we've also had support from other great people, who've been long involved. Fauzier, you mentioned you've been around and you've been supportive from the beginning. We've had many people who quietly have also, didn't always necessarily add their names to the open letter, which many of them found out much later because older folks are not on social media in general, but were able to lend their voices in other ways and support in other ways. We actually have a workshop of, I've been calling it in shorthand, a critical Somali studies workshop taking place at Harvard in April. And you know, we have a roundtable at the end, which will be some of the more established senior scholars after listening to panels of kind of newer interventions, then offering their thoughts on kind of Somali studies past, present, and what they've heard and what they're seeing for things in the future. So, I mean, there've been a lot of support, but for many also there's that there's a lot of silence also. There's a lot of resistance from others, particularly located in Europe from what I'm seeing. And I don't mean to bash Europe, but I mean, a lot of anti-theory and anti-reflexivity folks are kind of situated there in terms of how they've been approaching this discussion. But certainly there have been supportive people who have been involved in Somali studies for a long time. Kind of the question of also what's new in this analysis, what would we say to a traditionalist? Again, we've had people critique I.M. Lewis, you know, we've had people make these arguments, but I think what's new here is kind of that analysis of coloniality, that drawing from kind of very theoretical approaches. The call for theory and kind of theoretical rigor in Somali studies, I think, is new and testament to kind of a generation of kind of graduate students, younger folks who have been trained in that language, primarily in North America, and who are able to then speak in that language and apply that to Somali studies and kind of think of Somali studies as their vantage point for their work in that way. So I think kind of that analysis is new and interesting. I also think not just the social media dynamic, but this openness is also unique. I mean, before, you know, you'd have people write articles, still very closed access within these circles, but I think we've managed to engage a lot of people in and outside of the academy in really interesting ways and do this work from other platforms and other spaces, not just the academic journal. I think we've kind of destabilized that and kind of we write these shorter pieces, we do the op-eds, we have our podcast, you know, we have a website specifically for kind of articulating a certain critique. So I think that's also new. The question of the fraught terrain, you know, of Somali studies, that I don't know how to answer that because it's difficult. It's something that you'll always constantly have to wrestle with. It's something that I experienced very early on different sides. You know, the fact that the journal I was reacting to early on and we were responding to was called the Somaliland Journal of African Studies, kind of was felt in different ways by different people. You know, that, you know, why are they talking about Somaliland, or for other people, why are they speaking for Somaliland? So depending on people's politics, it was very different. Other people would be interested in kind of my clan background or where I'm coming from, as though I grew up here, I have no grasp of a lot of these things, but to many people they're interested in kind of boxing you in other ways. And interestingly enough, that's something that some non-Somali academics also try to do. I should emphasize that it's not just Somali people, but this idea that, you know, they're speaking about it because of this, or they're trapped in their own identities. These are things that are played by and manipulated by people who are not Somali as well. But it's something that we'll always have to navigate, and I think the challenge then is to always bring things back to the arguments and say, actually, you know, we're doing rigorous work. It's about theory, it's about argument, it's about history. It has nothing to do with me and dismissing me as an academic or the academic work I'm doing. But it's a challenge, absolutely. And why I kind of spoke a little bit about what's going on too is to see how that disciplining is taking place as a young person, you know, someone who, I mean, a PhD student's probably it's at the bottom of the food chain in terms of academic hierarchy. A young woman too, many of the discussions, as you know, have been very gendered, the attacks. Also, you know, racialized too, as a Somali person, as a black person. So all of these things are going on, and it's something we'll constantly have to deal with as people on the margins of academia, and the work that we're doing is on the margins.
Okay. Fine. The men are back.
Sorry, can I just respond? Can I
Yes.
just respond? Yeah. So it lands differently for me. My family is part of a minority caste. People are intimately aware, and if not, are constantly questioning who I am and where I'm from. Mire is a very common last name. So I often don't disclose my caste. I've only just, we published a series on Mandep, and I spent a long time deciding whether or not I would actively talk about the caste that I'm from. And so it lands differently on me, because my words are constantly delegitimized by the very people whose work I'm trying to legitimize. So there's a very interesting piece in that for me, and orality and storytelling is actually the safest place for me to be, which is also it's a place I want to be. It's also the safest place for me to be, because there's a way in which people relax some of those boundaries when I talk to them about something that seems frivolous. And storytelling and orality very often seem very frivolous. So, and then I'm not going to obviously engage in it. This is my analytic about the stories that you've told me. I'm just going to say, tell me the story. Tell me about the story. What does it mean for you? And one of the stories I'm primarily interested in is one of the founding ideas of what it means to be Somali, which is about the story of two brothers who went in search for water at their father's command. And they were told, if you run out of food to eat, you can eat the meat of a dead animal, right? The eldest brother ate the meat. You can eat the meat of a dead animal, but when you find fresh meat or fresh food, you have to then throw up the dead meat that you've eaten because it's najas, right? Very interesting story. The eldest brother ate the meat and refused to throw it up. The youngest brother ate the meat and threw it up. And the story goes that the eldest brother was then cast off and is now part of the Midyan people. Still related, but not one of us. And the younger brother went on to found the Somali people. That's the founding myth, is about my rejection from Somaliness, right? So there's a tension there. I'm constantly having to struggle with that. I can sit in rooms with elders who have no idea who I am, that tell these stories or make these comments or say these things, right? And it still lands on me differently, because there's a generation difference. So I can hear that story, and for the most part I hear it as a story. And then occasionally I see my elders, my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, my father in a room, and their response to the story is so visceral, because they're remembering what it means for injustice to take place. And I think that's why my framework is always about power. Somali hegemony is no different than systemic power. They reinforce one another, absolutely. But there's no real difference in how they play out. The context changes, absolutely. The people involved change, but it doesn't shift a lot. And I fundamentally think if we're talking about disrupting and dismantling power, then we're also talking about disrupting and dismantling Somali hegemony, Somali power as well, right? So, absolutely. And then I'm also a young woman. I'm a young Madiban woman. And their role, for time immortal, was to do female circumcision, right? So, where the hell does that place me? I have no idea. It's a very interesting conversation, and yet still there are places where I hold very specific kinds of privileges. My English is good, I'm articulate, I speak well, I'm clever. All those things matter, right? I carry a Canadian passport. My work is still more legitimate than a Madiban young woman from the Somali territory, right? And I think as long as we're able to hold both of those things, as however tension-filled they are, all of the ways in which we're both complicit and at mercy of very often, then I think, and we talk about power and all of it, then we do the work that we're trying to do. But it's a hard battle, especially I think at one point people were very vocally on social media being like, what clan is Hawa? Where is she from? Why is she involved? And on my op-ed, at the very last sentence, I think I said, to change into a better Somalia. Like, I was like, yeah, that's a great line. And I was attacked for months because I had said Somalia and not Somaliland. Like, literally. And I was just like, and at that point I was like, so Safia, I'm gonna need you to say something, because it's not, there's strategy there, right? The presumption is that if she's then from Somaliland, people from Somaliland will listen to her and maybe stop attacking me as much, right? But so I think there's ways in which Mandep also uses and employs a number of different strategies to kind of get around these things. And also, in as much as I have, in many times,
as much as I have privileges, it's important. Oftentimes when I speak, I talk about what it means to be queer and Somali, and how contested that is within a Somali space, right? Because that's a rebuttal I can handle, but I'm not going to ask a queer Somali to sit up here and have to handle that rebuttal, right? So I think we're always contesting and negotiating and fighting.
Okay, you had a question.
Well, first, thank you, Safia and Hawa. You guys are extremely articulate and very brave.
Now we can hear in the front.
Right, can you guys hear me? Yeah. So my question, after thanking you both for your comments today, or commenting more around, Safia, you alluded to the concept in Europe being quite different in terms of how academics view academia here, and not, just simply not knowing. How is Adan Studies creating a space for knowledge production in Somalia? And is there a space to continue that conversation? Because it goes back to your comment earlier, what is knowledge? How do we construct it, right? So we have a very North American view of what that knowledge is, but how is that space being created for Somalis in Somalia?
Yes.
First of all, thank you. This was wonderful. I had a great evening in here, to both of you. You mentioned about Lewis and what his writings, but other than him, you also mentioned Richard Burton. I was wondering if there is anything that stands out for you that Richard might have said about Somalia. Unfortunately.
So these are the last two questions because we have a story to listen to. I hope that wasn't the story.
It could be the story.
So we'll mine another story.
Okay, so Richard Burden, I was just thinking about him kind of in relation to the question that you had about knowledge and ignorance and whatnot. So I wrote a piece in April called The New Somali Studies, published in The New Inquiry, where I open with kind of this vignette of Richard Burden talking. He did some traveling through Somaliland, Egypt, Ethiopia and other parts. So the book's called First Footsteps in East Africa. I think published in because no one's had footsteps in East Africa before Richard Burden. But so he's in, at this point, he's in a city called Zela, which is a coastal city in the north. He arrives from Yemen, I believe, and then he goes there and he's talking about his observations, and he's talking about how Somalis there connect like fevers. At this point, he doesn't know it's malaria that he's talking about, but it's malaria he's referring to. But Somalis then connect fevers to bites from mosquitoes, and he thought, I mean, how absurd, how superstitious are these people that they think there's a connection between mosquito bites and fever. And I mean, later we would make that connection by, of course, European academics. The doctor, I believe, who discovered it was actually in North Africa when he found this out. So again, possibly you heard it from someone there. But the idea then that it was a European discovery to make the connection. But when a Somali had said it, or Somali people had exhibited this and known this, it's knowledge, but to him it was simply superstition. So I use that to kind of organize this idea that our critique was at that point being dismissed as being irrational, emotional, not very educated, because then Somalis are constantly framed in that way. So that's an interesting thing. And what's interesting too is I just saw a clip of kind of Somaliland had a delegation go to Ireland just I think a few days ago, and one of the guys there was talking about how the historical connections between Somaliland and Ireland are there and whatnot. And so he mentions Richard Burden, and Richard Burden loved our country, and therefore we have great affinity with the people of, and he was Welsh, but he called us the Irish of, East Africa or Africa. So it's interesting to see then the colonial ideas then being used by Somalis themselves and appropriated, which in problematic ways, but it just shows you how important some of these texts are and how they themselves feed back into these things. The ideas that I Am Lewis and others produce are then fed back into Somali people themselves. You might think an elder is telling you a story, he may have very well read that from I Am Lewis at a point, can relate it to that. This is what they said about us, and then rehearses it in another way. So that's something that I think we need to problematize. democratize even in our ideas of orality, this idea that there's feedback that exists and that European knowledge somehow sometimes makes its way back to people you wouldn't suspect, who are then kind of rehearsing that. So the question then of Adan Studies creating a space, I wouldn't say it's North American. I think for many of us who are trying to theorize this, we come from that perspective as people who are trained in institutions in North America. But I think what we're trying to do more than say that this is kind of knowledge located here is that there's no universal. That's something that I've been trying to emphasize. That in displacing that idea of this one dominant representation of Somalis, that you open up other spaces for that. And that could very well be then the Somali in Somalia or elsewhere in the Somali territories to assert a different idea then. It's more about democratizing and opening up space for multiple imaginings and multiple articulations and understandings rather than kind of replacing it with another model, I think. For us, I think the work that we're trying to do is create space for others to also articulate these things where spaces did not exist before.
And we're not, I can talk about living within the academic world and doing my work here. It doesn't mean that I'm also not replicating power. This whole gathering, for the most part, was done in English. That sets a very particular kind of tone for who's invited to it and who's not, right? So, there needs to be more work done. This is the thing, is that I think what often happens when you ek out a tiny space is well, why isn't it bigger? We just got our foot into the window. Let's make it bigger. There's no argument that it has to be much wider and much broader than it has been so far. Part of it is okay, and capacity. It's we're getting there. We're getting there very quickly. And the interesting thing that people, and it's very important what you said, it's not often the Somali folks using the distinction between diaspora and continental Somalis to drive a wedge right in between what that looks like. Very often it's the same folks who are contesting our existence in this academy at all that are also saying, well, what have you done for the Somali people in the Horn? What have you done in your elite institution? And it's a distraction technique, right? It's used, instead of us having a dialogue about what else needs to be done, the response is then, oh, those people in Canada don't care about us. Somehow as if being here doesn't come with its own particular set of complications, right? Or they don't care about you, we're the ones funding you. And there's a very weird piece, right? We realize even as we're disrupting, the folks we're disrupting are the folks also putting money into the Somali territories. They're funding the projects. So there's no dissension available very often, right? I think with the Someone Tell Mary Harper. Mary Harper's a journalist, that's a loose term, but a journalist based in the UK and writes very frequently about the Somali territories, primarily around kind of the terrorist, piracy, the usual narratives, and writes for BBC Africa, and put a recent article out about the Mogadishu Book Fair, which was a really brilliant kind of undertaking following the legacy of the Hargeisa Book Fair, around Somalis in Mogadishu gathering around reading and books and literature, and kind of the first time this has happened in a very long time. She put a picture of a recently bombed Al Jazeera hotel and wrote 3 sentences about the Somali Book Fair and then a paragraph around, this is surprising considering the country is in turmoil and there are jihadists and terrorists, and totally changed the narrative that people were trying to build. So someone started a hashtag that said, somebody tell Mary Harper, which had a lot of resistance to it. Someone tell Mary Harper that, there are 150 young Somalis here in reading, that our country has the highest, whatever, all these kinds of things to kind of rebuttal this narrative. And it was started, very importantly, by folks based in Mogadishu who were at the Mogadishu Book Fair, and then continued through kind of social media. And folks that did this, the Somali-based journalists that did this, got phone calls threatening to cut their funding, threatening to lose their jobs if they didn't stop the people who were working on the hashtag. And you see what that creates now between folks in the diaspora who are like, yeah, let's pump this out, let's get some visibility. We're now in a position where people are saying, stop because this impacts my life. So do you stop? Do you continue? It's a constant, and it's not ourselves putting ourselves in those positions. We're very frequently manipulated into those positions. So
more work needs to be done, absolutely. And I think this workshop and social media and all of these methods and the podcast where people can call into Google Hangouts, and which is a easily used internet platform, like we're trying to find ways to make this available to the most amount of people and have the most amount of Somalis be involved as possible.
Can we hear that story?
I don't know which story to tell. I think maybe I'll tell the crocodile and the fox. But if anybody, does anyone know the crocodile and the fox story?
I do.
No? This is like a classic. This is my favorite. I know Minnesota's really obsessed with the Shida. Like so obsessed. And I only heard one story about him. I was like, they really love him. I don't know, maybe they all grew up in the same region of Somalia or something. Okay, so the story of the crocodile and the fox is one that my mom used to tell us all the time when we were young. The crocodile and the fox. And I remember that she told us because when I was 6, I wrote it for an assignment for school and submitted it. And I lied to my teacher and said I had made it up. My story. And then I brought it home and I was like, oh, I got such a great record. And my teacher had written a note saying, you have such a great imagination. And my mom had said, stop taking stories that you didn't make and telling these white folks that you made them. That was like precisely what she said to me. So yeah, like you know. So the story of the crocodile and the fox is that in the forests of Africa, Somalia is often what she said. In the forests of Somalia, there were a lot of different animals that often gathered together to eat, to play, to do all kinds of things. And in this forest, there was a very smart and cunning fox. I really want to make it good, but I feel on the spot. And so the fox's sister was having a huge wedding. It was a very kind of important wedding. It was her eldest sister, and this is what my mom said to me. Her eldest sister, she was the first in the family to get married, and everyone was very excited. And everyone had something to contribute to the wedding. The mother was organizing the bramba, the other sister was doing all the cooking, and so this fox was very worried about what her contribution was going to be to this wedding, because it was her eldest sister's wedding, and she wanted it to be something that was quite good. And she remembered that the crocodile in the lake had an exceptionally long tongue. And she thought to herself, that would be perfect. I can sing for the wedding. And because the crocodile has such a long tongue, you know that, I can't do it properly. Because the crocodile has such a long tongue, I'll be able to trill very loudly. And I'll bring people together to start the dancing. So she thought to herself, how am I going to get this tongue? So she went to the river and said, crocodile, please come out. There's something I need to ask you. Come out. And the crocodile knew that the fox could be sneaky and wasn't sure. So she stayed a little bit away from the water's edge and poked her head out and said, what can I help you with? What do you need? The fox said, please, crocodile, come on to the riverbank. I'm not going to ask you anything that's going to make you nervous. Just, and you're much bigger than I am, and you've got teeth and a mouth. You could snap me in half. The crocodile was like, that's true. I do have a jaw, so I could do something to you, but still was like, stay a little bit away in case of anything. The crocodile came out of the water, and the fox said to her, I have been so mesmerized by the way that you call the other animals to drink at the water. You have such a lovely voice and such a lovely tongue. I wish I could do what you do. The crocodile was like, oh, it's not that difficult. This is what God gave this tongue. So I just do what God has given me. Use what God has given me. And then the fox said, okay, well, it was really nice chatting with you. I'm going to leave now. Left, waited a day or so, and then came back to the water's edge. This time, the crocodile came all the way out of the water to greet the fox. Said, hello, fox. It's been a while since I've seen you last. Thank you. Welcome for coming. What can we do? How's it going? And the fox began to cry. Said, oh, my sister is having her wedding next week, and I have nothing to bring to this wedding. What am I going to do? The crocodile was like, oh, if I could help you, I would, but I don't know what I could offer you. The fox said, could I borrow your tongue? I promise I'll bring it right back when the wedding is over. And the crocodile was like, okay, you've already come twice to visit me. You can borrow my tongue. But fox, I'm warning you, you have a bad reputation in this forest with the other animals. If you do not return with my tongue, you are never allowed to come back and drink in this river. And the fox was like, of course, absolutely, took the tongue, went to the wedding, and did this beautiful song for her sister. Everyone was clapping. She was the star of the show. Her mother asked her, did you get that tongue? She said, Mom, I grew it. Myself. It's fine. And her mom was like, mashallah. Beautiful daughter who has a tongue. You'll sing for all of your cousins' weddings. So, the fox never went back to give the crocodile its tongue. And this is the very important part of the story. And to this day, foxes do not drink from water where crocodiles dwell.
Great.